Today is June 8, Ukraine Media Center Ukraine-Ukrіnform continues its operation. My name is Vasyl Samakvalov, and now we will be talking about why do Ukrainian peace-building experts see no sense in peace negotiations now. So whom are we going to talk to? Olena Zakharova, head of the Center of Public Initiatives Ideas for Change. Maxim Yligulashvili, the Institute of Peace and Common Ground Ukraine 5 AM Coalition. Irina Eigelson, candidate of Psychological Sciences, Mediation and Dialogue Research Center, National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and Oksana Potapova, co-founder of Ukrainian Feminist Network for Freedom and Democracy. Good afternoon. So we're seeing you. You may raise your hand if you want to draw our attention or you want to join our conversation. So the topic that you've stated is very interesting, so my question will be quite plain. Why do the Ukrainian peace-building experts see no sense in peace negotiations now? Let me start. I think we should expand the frame here because generally speaking, today's discussion focuses more on the tactical challenges, technical issues, because after the year of the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian Federation, the previous tools are being actualized, the ones that were used during previous periods of war regarding the use of narratives or messages to weaken Ukrainian position in international arenas. So now when we talk about these truth negotiations, the refusal of truth negotiations, which according to the recent signals, according to the recent signals from the West, they try to promote the statement which is based on the Russian vision, like it's truth, stop, let's stop the war, or I'd rather say stop the active phase, and those territories that are under control of the Russia, we don't actualize any problems of resumption of warfare. So in fact, it's a loss or recognition of the status quo that exists for the time being. So it's definitely not within the zone of Ukrainian interest and regional interest, I mean the regional dimension of security. So talking about the challenges that exist, the dynamics which existed without the last 15 to 20 years, they say that the tactical calls to negotiations are mostly used as the pose for preparation of the more active aggression or another type of aggression. So it's one aspect. And another aspect, something that I would like to add from the very beginning, maybe my colleagues will join me later in this. So one of the examples, we continue tracking these or those messages and narratives in the platforms where we have addresses, and if those messages did not exist previously, there is a barrage of them within the last, say, couple of months. For example, the conference in Vienna, which was announced as the framework for peace with engagement of a lot of reputed organizations, but thanks to the synchronous position of the conflictologists, facilitators of the dialogue, and other civil organizations, the lion's share of the reputed organizations which agreed to it, because it's a peace negotiations when it was stated that it's a peace based on the condition of the termination of the arms aid, the weapons aid for Ukraine. So when it all started, this coordinated activity helped refuse this idea of legitimization of this negotiation. So now we can be talking about the quite successful practice, but I would like to summarize and say that it's a tactical thing. We've seen it for a long time. 1 year was necessary to get back to the global platforms with this idea, and now we're looking for another cycle of challenges related to the soft component of propaganda and misinformation, which is being reinforced, and talking about the context related to the crimes, talking about Bucha, Mariupol, and other contexts. They were perceived and they were non-efficient in terms of dilution by Russia of those events in the West. So the most recent tragedy, and talking about the Western countries and other countries in the world, this message that it's not so unambiguous, it still works, and it may reinforce those negotiations, the peace negotiations, on the conditions of the aggressor, and the consolidated position is necessary to avoid this dimension of negotiations that Russia would like, the aggressor would like to set them in. So I would like to ask something that you're stating here. Is it a reaction to the latest actions by Russia? Because we see that there is a very drastic course set for freezing the conflict, in fact, the search for peace. So obviously not only the latest actions, but starting from 2014 there was a very powerful community of the experts, peace building experts, working with us, and for us it's obvious that all those calls to truce or ceasefire, they gravitate to other contexts. For example, when it's an internal conflict between two ethnic groups, or there is a regional conflict, the groups in the society start using some violence activities to achieve their interests. The ceasefire and the negotiations table, let's see how we redistribute different resources in a more fair manner, or we're looking for the political agencies. So those are the traditional peace building frameworks. We have a completely different context. There is a misbalance of forces between Ukraine and Russia, and the ceasefire together with the termination of military support of Ukraine will result in surrender of Ukraine, in fact. And we also see that those territories that are temporarily occupied, whether it's 9 years or just recently, starting from the February 2022, there is no peace there. There are horrible stories with violation of human rights going on there. The horrible tragedy that Maxim has just mentioned. We know that in the occupied territories where the flooding is more intense, no help is provided to the people. So we see that the ceasefire in those lines that exist now, they don't result in any sustainable peace. So our call was that such freezing will not result in any sustainable peace, and termination of any support of Ukraine, including military support, weapons support, is just the surrender of the Ukrainian interests. Okay, thank you. So let's give the floor to another speaker, the peace building experts against peace negotiations is an oxymoron. So how do you live with this oxymoron? It's not an oxymoron, but I want to say that in parallel with the urge to continue providing military support to Ukraine, Ukraine makes unprecedented effort to settle this situation, to settle this conflict. And I'm not only talking about the years 22-23. If we go back into history, Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear potential. 17% of the nuclear arms of the Soviet Union were in Ukraine, and having signed the Lisbon Agreement, Ukraine refused the nuclear arms, and Ukraine joined the non-proliferation of nuclear arms agreement in this way. And at the same time, all these years, starting from the beginning of 2000s, Ukraine was facing pressure by Russian Federation. The conflict around the island of Tuzla, the gas wars, the economic pressure, political pressure, the pressure over the elections of the president, all those conflicts and tension, Ukraine was trying to settle it in a peaceful way. I want to remind you the Orange Revolution was peaceful, and starting from years 2013, 2014, Ukraine rejected to defend Crimea, refused to defend Crimea in a military way, and a lot of dialogues started evolving from 2014, a lot of programs, first in the civil society, and then they were going up to the government level. The programs aimed at peaceful reintegration, as it was said back then, the specific regions of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. There was the center established at the Ministry of Reintegration. Ukraine agreed to the Minsk agreements. We were taking part in this negotiation process. We were trying to use that platform to somehow peacefully settle this situation. Even with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine does not only urge to give more weapons to us, but we work in other areas too. For example, if we take the peace plan of Mr. President Zelensky that he proclaimed before the G19, we see that all those articles, they are of peaceful nature. If we take the expert group of Yermak Rasmussen or the group of Yermak Makfol, they aim at peaceful means, either through sanctions, either through pressure or some guarantees beyond NATO. So I want to emphasize that there is a parallel work underway. It's not only about the weapons, so Ukrainian peace-building experts continue working on arrangement of this dialogue inside the society. So if we imagine, for example, that the truce negotiations are going on now, will they result in sustainable peace in the region? Absolutely not. They will result to the frozen conflict, and it's quite probable that a generation will be raised that will be growing in the totalitarian empire state, and in 10 or 15 years they will be engaged in new imperial wars initiated by Russia, as it happened to Ukrainians during the war in Afghanistan. So we have to understand the bigger picture, what those calls result in. Thank you very much. It's clear. So let's listen to Ms. Oksana. Why and how should it be drawn up as a joint statement, the participation and coordination? I understand already why, but I'm more curious about how the Ukrainian peace-building experts will deliver their message to the world. Thank you. I would like to add yet another statement that I'm hearing from a lot of initiatives and organizations which urge to non-armed settlement of this war. There are many feministic researchers and activists who during other armed conflicts that they researched or where they were taking part in as activists, they make emphasis on a big or the biggest influence on the civil population, specifically on women and children and other vulnerable categories. And it really exists. We say that the continuation of war deteriorates the infrastructure. It adds a load on the women. It displaces the women from different areas of social life. Those are very important arguments, but unlike other armed conflict, for example civil wars, that may really that may really end in a peaceful way and restore normal life in the country. In our case, this argument does not work, as it was mentioned by my colleagues, because the armed resistance or termination of armed resistance will leave Russia as a state which promotes anti-human rights policies for more than 10 years. They consciously, intentionally offend the human rights, LGBT rights, women's rights, and this is what happens in the territories under Russian control. So there are no talks about the protection of civilians in those territories which are beyond Ukrainian control. And the latest situation with evacuation of people from Kherson and Kherson region, it evidences that the volunteers are taking care of the safety and security of the people, and Russia and its representatives, they only create obstacles to such evacuation. And this is another example which confirms that the termination of armed resistance now will deteriorate the situation with the human rights, with the women's rights in future in all those territories. So talking about what we do now by jointly addressing, by uniting the efforts of a number of communities, the feministic community, the human rights community, in engaging our partners who work with these problems in the international level. It's one of the strategies to reach out to different communities abroad, talking to them with arguments, with the statements that they will hear and understand. Maybe my colleagues may pick up on how it can be done in other ways. So if I may ask for details, I understand that the main recipient of your message is the West, the Western organizations, because from the point of view of average citizen, the desire of Ukraine to continue the war, it looks anti-humanistic, as Russians they say, and it's contrary to their expectations, because they don't need any anxiety, any peace. The perspective of drinking coffee with a croissant is way better than the perspective of nuclear war, as Russians put it. So how can you convince your colleagues in the West, those with whom you communicate in the West, that this way of resistance, the way of fight for freedom, is the right way? Because people keep dying, they see those catastrophes. The day before yesterday, everybody has seen the Kakhovka HPP. It's in all the screens, and it's a horror for them. They understand that in their logic, in their system of values, is their horror that should be stopped right here, right now, and then we'll sort things out. So how do we explain to them that it's no way out of this situation for us? Well, I would like to give you more detail. I think that that statement that was promulgated, it's aimed at the West mostly. Yeah, so please tell us more about this statement. What was the statement that you've signed? Well, in fact, is the continuation of the statement that we will mix it all together, the statement and how we will mix it in one vial. So what Oksana said about the consolidation of the communities, for example, the peace builders are the drivers there, like Coalition 5 AM Ukraine as the human rights organization. They get engaged because they understand that this sustainable peace, it's not only built on the peace agreement, but it should be built on the guarantees of security, including in those territories where Russia exercises effective control. So it's the evidence that there are no such guarantees for civilians there. And talking about their arguments, those are not the guarantees of security for the region, because the consequences of technogenic and the ecological catastrophe, they will be colossal. That's one dimension. Another thing is the food security, because Kherson region was exactly the territory which provided for the segment of the food products of Ukraine and they covered not only 100% of this market, but they were a very significant part of it, and we've lost this component for the time being, and we don't know how long it will take to recover. So we're not talking only about the man-made influence, but also about the system of irrigation which provided for that possibility, because it's not only about Kherson but also about Zaporizhia and Mykolaiv regions. So this is one argument, that the continuation of this war results in the growth of security risks, and this amplitude, I'm talking conditional, it started with a more or less peaceful occupation of Crimea, but again there were people abducted and killed. There was a humanitarian catastrophe related to the displacement, so we cannot say that it was a completely peaceful process, but at least it was there was not such a big number of victims in this process. The number of victims was growing in the east of Ukraine, and now those figures reach some abnormal level. So now we're only increasing the level of the threats, and this is one of the arguments that should work not only for the West. It has more broad audience, but I think that here we're ending up in some gap when we're talking about how to do it. We should talk about not how to do it, but how not to do it. For example, we say that we have to talk to the West, but the world is much bigger than the West. But I understand that, for example, with my parents, I use one way of communication, another way of communication is something that I use with my neighbors on the left, who are nice, and I don't talk the same way to the neighbors on top of me because they're not so nice. So I'm simplifying it here, but we have to build this communication. The Russia, for the time being, uses the old traumas. They try to put it into dimension of a global crisis. They use colonial and post-colonial narratives, aspects, something sensitive, some sensitive topics, to explain this logic of actions, that it's not armed aggression, that it's a protection. And if Ukraine does not resist, everything would go normal, and I can continue on and on. And for us as an expert community and the population, we have to grow up. We have to start understanding it, and we should start working with it. We should understand all those trigger moments where they can react and how they can help promote this or that statement, because for the time being we are on the wave of emotional upheaval, adrenaline upheaval, but it actually requires some more rational, cold-headed approach, the so-called headed, maybe cynical selection of messages and tools. And another aspect that I would like to add when we're talking about the negotiations and the architecture of security, architecture of justice, I'm talking in a broad context here, because in the Institute for Peace and in the Coalition 5 AM Ukraine, we're talking about the aspects of a transitional justice for Ukraine, what it should be looking like. It shouldn't boil down to legal mechanisms, but also to non-legal mechanisms that would allow us to stabilize the system. And I think the part of these negotiations about the stabilization should be the goodwill of Ukraine, which is demonstrated by Ukraine, that we're looking for the ways out, not of the situation, not only for our country, but in the whole basin of the Black Sea and in the post-Soviet space, including the Baltic countries and Scandinavia, the frozen conflicts that are not being solved within more than 30 years in Transnistria, Abkhazia, Ossetia, and I can continue this list. So we're getting a chance to build the new approaches, the new framework, but it will definitely require understanding of the fact that the world is not only West, but it's bigger, and we will have to find more arguments for the people, and they refuse to provide support, not because they don't want, but they just don't understand the language they were being talked to, but they just need to reject this coffee and croissant. But it's just the adequate situation when you are away from the context, and you should be convinced in the terms that you understand. And the third aspect is we have to understand the way the international institutions work. There is a lot of requests in the context of international institutions, but this aspect of understanding their logic, the mandates of bureaucrats, it's very important for timely use of those tools, because demanding the immediate reaction from big institutions without providing evidences, it's quite complicated. We document the war crimes, and frequently it happens so that without the properly documented information you cannot talk about this or that thing. So the same is happening here. And Ukrainian expert society, the civil society, have this obligation to collect together all the evidences for the international bureaucrats, because now it looks so that Russian Federation understands this logic and they use it quite efficiently in this or those platforms. For example, if it was not for timely reaction of the Vienna conference that was prepared by a number of movements who are definitely no agents to Russia, but still they exist in their narratives, in their logic, in their history of 20, 30, 100 years of fight for freedom all around the world, and they use those narratives, and we have to learn those narratives to stabilize those situations. Okay, so tell us more about the statement, who signed it and who is the recipient. Yes, this is exactly what I wanted to say, and I also wanted to continue a little bit about how. So one good expert recently, a great expert who supports Ukraine, he asked me, well, from one of the Western countries, he asked me if I see any program for work with trauma for our top-level government officials so that they approach the peace negotiations in a more constructive manner. And the first thing I asked him was that, why do you think that the problem with the peace negotiations is that someone has some trauma? So I'm saying that we have to continue talking to the people who support us, but they don't always understand the context. I mean, the human rights people, scientists, civil organizations, journalists. So it's not about convincing those who spent the last 30 years in the narratives of the Russian world, but I'm talking about those for whom it's really important to talk to explain our position. And us as a peace-building Ukrainian experts, we see us as a part, or not even a part, but proactive agents in the view that we have to sit together with the specialists from other countries and to build a new framework for peace building, which could be relevant and efficient in the context of armed aggression. And the statement, our statement, is one of the steps that we've made to say that we are a subject with the situation from inside. We have the mediators, the human rights people join us, a number of psychological, psychotherapeutical organizations that work with trauma, the war trauma, some feministic movements, for example, one of them represented by Oksana and the scientists. Everybody got united, a broad community of different signatories, organizations, and individual. And it's more than 100 of us. Our colleagues started supporting us with the translations. We have versions in English, Ukrainian, French, Spanish, Italian, and now we're waiting for the French translation. It's a goodwill of those people who have read that statement and wanted not only to support it, but to support it in this efficient way. It contains 10 articles of our vision, what we see as the things important to build the peace in Ukraine, or in the context of the armed aggression of Russian Federation. In part, I've already mentioned the termination of the weapons support. So let's just list those articles. So what we see the threat in growth of the voices to terminate to terminate the weapons support of Ukraine. I've mentioned it already that non-supply of such weapons will not result in the sustainable peace which we can observe in the occupied territories. We also mentioned that if we are being pressed to agree that the part of the temporarily occupied territories remains under Russian control, it's a very dangerous precedent, dangerous case for other regimes with imperial nostalgia to commit such actions in future. We also mentioned that it's very important to honor the rights of Ukrainians to identify, to stipulate how we see the achievement of peace. Don't decide it for us what the world should look like. Please respect our vision. We said that we value all kinds of support, humanitarian negotiations, contacts as to the return of the people from captivity, return of the abducted children, withdrawal of Russian troops. So we're not saying, getting back to the very first question, we're not against any negotiations. There are negotiations going on. They're going on in this sense, and we value all the support in this regard. But we would rather want the aware solidarity, where informed solidarity, where we can reevaluate the traditional approaches to peace building with engagement of Ukrainian peace building experts, and the fact that we as Ukrainians, as a nation, as a state, we choose to live in a world where the human rights, human lives, democracy, international law, freedom of speech are valued. And this is the way we see Ukrainian peace, together with Europe, with the Western world, but it's not only important to talk to the global South specifically. Maybe Oksana will add a little bit about this context, that it's not only about the civilized countries, West America and Japan, but it's also about Africa, Asia and Latin America. I would even like to ask Ms. Oksana about the international feministic movements. They are traditionally very pacifistic because pacifism is one of their fundamental values. But how to convince the international feministic movements that Ukraine should continue the war until our victory? I'll try to unite the answers to these two questions in a coy manner. You're right, the support of non-proliferation of arms, termination of wars is one of the values of feministic movements. Feministic movements pay a lot of attention to the influence of wars on the civil population, on the women, and on long-term consequences, not only during the conflict but afterwards. And I have to say that the way we would like to see Ukraine after the war, that it should be inclusive, safe and democratic, but it's not about that. Earlier this year we had a small research that I've made for my colleagues about the origins of feministic pacifistic movements. I've realized that this movement was created historically between the World War I and World War II as a reaction to the big wars in Europe, and as a proposal for the European communities to switch to a different way of settlement of relations between the states, as an argument that we as a society, we are growing up enough to not to make war but to negotiate peace. And the feministic movements had, including suffragists, the activists for women's rights in the beginning of the last century, and for the women's labor rights, they united their demands for peace and for women's rights. I think this slogan is still very actual, but there is a small nuance. The countries where those movements were built and raised were Britain, France, Germany, United States of America. During that period, all those countries were at the same time the colonizers. And in the history of peace building, we forget that those who were creating the agenda, the peace agenda in Europe in the beginning of the last century, they did not include the voices from the colonized countries and the representatives of the movements which aspired, first of all, the freedom from colonization. For them, peace was not possible without such freedom, without liberation. That's why in the crowds of activists and in the academic circles, very popular is the argument that we have to use the post-colonial optics when we talk about the peace on the regional and global level. Ukraine now only joins this discussion about the decolonization, but it's important to understand that this conversation is going on for long years. We're living in a world that has a history of colonization, and we cannot avoid the fact that many countries that Ukraine sees as allies in this war, on the support of whom we rely, they have the colonizer experience, and it's a very complex story that forms the reactions of the countries of the global south. In simple words, they see Ukraine stating about decolonization but rely upon the support or experience or solidarity of the countries with imperial or colonial past without rethinking it, without offering to rethink it. So one of the questions how should sound as like we as Ukrainians, we have to educate ourselves about how the global context of decolonization looks not only for our region, meanwhile it's most important for us, but also for the countries of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and what is the colonial solidarity among us. For example, what Maxim said, we want to see the world where injustice and the consequences of imperial violence, of long-term imperial violence, will not exist, not only for us, but for other formerly colonized subjects. So it's not about the diplomatic relations between the countries, but it's about the ties and exchange of experience, statements between different movements on the horizontal level, movement for labor rights, movement for women's rights, movement for social justice, social well-being in those countries, movements for the rights of migrants. They are very important, and one of such examples, I think it's a very important precedent that I was observing in Germany, where I am now. You may know that there is a huge community of Ukrainians in Germany who moved in just recently, and there is another community who were living here for a long time, and within last years this community was mobilized seriously, and one of their requirements, one of the demands that they put in front of the German government, apart from the weapons support, is the rights of the migrants in Europe, in Germany, and it includes not only Ukrainian migrants but the migrants from all other countries where the conflicts erupted in the past, the Afghans, the Syrians, because they are deprived of many rights that Ukrainians have. So this is an example for me how this solidarity is spreading across the groups, how we build those connections, and this solidarity may be mutual in my opinion, and it illustrates when Ukrainians talk about justice, we are not only talking about ourselves, about our country, we're talking about justice for everybody. And we're capable of building this solidarity, and we would like to expect for such solidarity from the others. Okay, let's give the floor to Miss Olena. You are a person who in your first statement touched upon Russia, and we understand that the collective world or the West, it may already get used to the thought that Ukraine may win, but they may not get used to the thought that Russia may lose. So talking about the global configuration, it includes Russia as a part of this configuration. So the question is simple: what should be the condition of Russia so that this peace is satisfactory for us? So our Western colleagues are not very frequently not ready to discuss this issue. We're only seeing some trends that are evolving now. Okay, so what do we have to say to our foreign colleagues? In a condition like this, the way this country was existing within the last 100 or 200 years, maybe 200 years, those statements were not so actual. So in a humanistic society, such country cannot exist. So we have to look for the forms where it can embody itself. How do we make sure that this country or the countries that then appear in its territory are democratic, so there is no tyranny, there is no threat of political persecutions, political murders? So it's a political issue. It's difficult to discuss it publicly. I would prefer to have those issues discussed by some experts in some closed meetings behind the closed doors, and it's desirable probably to talk to some Russian liberals, but non-publicly, just to find out what is their opinion, to start this process somehow in this way. Don't you have a feeling that this indefinite attitude of the West, that they don't have a recipe whether they can reload or they cannot reload Russia, is in fact this cornerstone? Well, in fact, nobody has a recipe how to do it. We have to understand that it's our joint task, our common task of Ukraine, of the West, of the global South, and even those peoples who live in the Russian Federation, to build this architecture of the future, to analyze and take into account the mistakes that were committed, what were the problems with the international organizations which were called and created to protect the peace, democracy, and Ukraine has to win. This is one of the arguments for our Western colleagues, because it has to be the victory of democracy. We cannot give autocracy and tyranny a chance to win, to make a case when one country can attack another country. This is what should unite us. Do we have any questions on the floor? Good afternoon, Svetlana Tkachuk, Ukr.Inform. I would like to ask you the following question. You've come to the conclusion that now it makes no sense to set up any peace negotiations with the aggressor, but can we state that the victory of the armed forces of Ukraine is a premise for peace negotiations? Or maybe you see some other event that may influence the countries of the West to force Russia to peace? Well, it may be a number of factors. We may brainstorm and work them out. One of such factors may be a change of the ruling actors in Russian Federation, or generally the change of actors. Make another revolution again. Well, we're not talking about revolution, we're talking about rethinking and solution of those threats that exist for the time being. Do you want to add something? It's not a trivial question, actually. Well, apparently our victory in the battlefield would be a very powerful factor, but I would rather put it in a different way. Peace negotiations are better when we have some powerful arguments to make sure that the result of this negotiations takes into account our interest to the maximum extent. I understand that for the journalist, it's always better to have something more concrete, but I'm just trying to say that we have not achieved the victory so far, and as a psychologist I can say that the permanent expectation that the victory is about to happen tomorrow is not useful for your psyche. We still have to experience a lot of things as humans and as a society, but I'm saying that we should sit at the negotiations table when we feel strong enough to achieve our goals. And our interest should be, first of all, the interests of the people who are for the time being in temporarily occupied territories. Are you ready to look those people right in the eye? For example, those who are in the left bank of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk regions, and are you ready to tell them that they are doomed to another 10 or 20 years in those inhuman conditions where all they may expect is the murders, tortures, deportation, and all other horrors of Russian walls? Are you ready to tell them that we leave them just to make sure the others survive? Is it a moral compromise? Any more questions? No, I'm having just a comment. I've asked this question in the context of detonation of the HPP dam, because there should be a catastrophe that should terrify the world, but probably we're not getting the reaction that we were expecting to get. Well, Irina was talking from the position of the psychologist. I'll talk about this from the position of the historian. It seems like the world was democratic, but no, it never was. I'm the first generation in my family who has freedom of movement, because the others didn't have such freedom in context of passport and the freedom. No one could leave the country, and the same is about the feministic agenda. It seems to us that the women were voting forever. Well, in the Soviet Union, they used to vote way earlier than in the democratic countries. So here we're talking about the formal and informal things. But when we say that we want to talk with the global south about this feministic optics, the argument about the women voting, it works. So that this is the dimension of democracy and the formal approach. But we're not going too deep into details about the one candidate and one party. So there were quotes, there were election lists, voting lists. So when we talk about the armed victory, we're talking about the fairness, but there are other scenarios, and believe me, they're numerous. And the more rational we approach this issue, not only in terms of weapons, but also moral challenges that Olena mentioned, the simpler for us it will be to do it. In the same way, when we talk about what Russia should look like, I'm start getting this impression from this discussion. I have this impression that we're transforming into Russia ourselves when we start thinking of another country through the prism of something that we can do something there. It's their own business. And I understand as a region we will be affected. It's my emotional reaction, but I know, no matter how cynical it sounds, but it will happen. And now when we demand something from the world, we have to understand a more broad global context. For example, League of Nations was unable to work. We've built United Nations. There is a wonderful book about one of the commissioners for human rights who died in Baghdad, and his parents were dreaming that he would have like one employment, one profession, and he started working with the Department for Human Rights in the United Nations. Only 8 persons were working there back then, but now there is a huge machinery working there. So now we have this chance to fix this big system as Ukraine, which would not lead to a catastrophe, and there were catastrophes. United Nations was born in the bottom of the World War II, and there is another aspect. Can we become a leader? We want justice for Ukraine, and we demand such justice, but we don't ratify the Rome Statute, and there is the contradiction. You know, there may be questions to a country that promotes some narratives. For example, we want it, but we want everything to be fixed, but we don't want to donate to get our home repaired, something like that. I'm simplifying it, obviously. We want to become a voice for the global south in the context of justice, because other countries of Africa or Latin America or Asia, they were waiting for a long time to have the proceedings in their regard initiated. Do we want to become the driver, not as a pusher, in this development of the international justice, as a country which demonstrates that our justice system may become an efficient tool to bring in the guilty ones to liability? So let's talk about this dimension too, about the joint responsibility for those challenges, and the scenarios will be becoming, in my opinion, different. And for me, it's not about complications, but more about the opportunities. How can we act, not only move back and forth, maybe sometimes diagonally, sometimes aside? Thank you very much. We unfortunately have to wrap it up because we have our next briefing in 7 minutes. We had Ukrainian peace-building experts visiting us who were trying to convince us that as of today, in this configuration, the peace negotiations will be only of harm to Ukraine, and we hope that another configuration will exist when peace negotiations will bring us closer to the peace. In 6 minutes, we will be talking with the State Emergency Service about the tragedy in Kakhovka HPP.